When you reach 73, people stop asking what you want and start telling you what you should do. And I learned that the hard way the afternoon my children sat me down at the dining table like I was an agenda item instead of their father, their faces wearing that careful mix of concern and impatience that pretends to be love. My son Farhan cleared his throat first, always the one who liked to sound responsible, and said, "Abu, we need to talk about the future." A sentence that sounded harmless until I realized he meant a future without me at the center of it, and my daughter Nayla nodded along, lips pressed tight, already rehearsing agreement. I looked at them from my seat, hands folded calmly in my lap, noticing details I hadn't paid attention to before. The way Farhan avoided my eyes, the way Nayla kept glancing at her phone, the way neither of them had asked how my knees were doing that week. "What future?" I asked quietly, though I already knew. Farhan sighed, leaning back like a man burdened by duty. "Abu, let's be honest, you don't really have much left to manage. No big responsibilities, no active work. We think it's time we start making decisions for you." Decisions for you. That was when I understood this wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion they'd reached without me. Nayla jumped in gently, the way she always did when she wanted to soften a blow. "We're just worried," she said. "You live so simply, you barely spend anything, you don't go anywhere. It's not healthy to just exist." Exist. The word landed heavier than an insult. I had existed through wars, through shortages, through nights when their mother and I counted coins before deciding whether to buy vegetables or medicine, through decades of work that never came with applause but always came with responsibility, and now my children were telling me existence wasn't enough because it didn't look impressive. "We've been talking," Farin continued, "about downsizing, maybe selling some things. There's no point holding on to assets you don't even use." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "What assets?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear what they thought I owned. Farhan hesitated, then shrugged. "Well, whatever there is, the house may be savings if any." If any, Nayla added, "Abu, we know you didn't really plan financially. You were always simple, content with little." There it was, the assumption that my discipline was ignorance, that my quiet was emptiness. I felt a flicker of something in my chest, not anger but sadness, because this misunderstanding hadn't happened overnight. It had grown slowly, fed by my silence and their comfort. "We don't want things to become complicated later," Farhan said, his tone turning practical. "Estate matters are easier when there's not much involved." Not much involved. I almost smiled at that, but I didn't. Instead, I asked, "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Farhan exchanged a look with Nayla. "We think," he said carefully, "that it might be best if we handle your affairs going forward. Maybe we can schedule an estate meeting, get things formalized, just in case." Just in case, those words people use when they want control without responsibility. I nodded slowly. "An estate meeting," I repeated. Nayla relaxed slightly, mistaking my calm for agreement. "Yes," she said, "it'll give us clarity, peace of mind." Peace of mind for whom, I wondered, but I didn't say it out loud. I simply nodded again. "All right," I said, "let's do that." The relief on their faces was immediate, and it stung more than their concern because it told me they'd been waiting for permission to move me aside. That evening, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the old photograph of their mother on my bedside table, her eyes warm and knowing even in print. "They think I have nothing left," I whispered, not bitter, just tired. She had always warned me that children raised in comfort forget the weight of sacrifice, and I had brushed it off, believing love would cover the gap. Love, it turns out, needs memory to survive. The days before the meeting passed quickly, filled with polite distance. Farhan began speaking to me like a consultant rather than a son, asking pointed questions about paperwork, while Nayla suggested I simplify my belongings as if my life could be condensed into boxes without loss. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them when they assumed there was little to discuss. Instead, I prepared quietly, pulling out the folders I hadn't touched in years, the ones their mother insisted we keep organized even when money was tight, even when I told her it wasn't necessary. She always smiled and said, "Order protects dignity," and now, flipping through those documents, I understood exactly what she meant. On the morning of the estate meeting, Farhan drove us to the lawyer's office, humming to himself, confident in a way that only ignorance allows, while Nayla sat in the passenger seat scrolling through messages, already distracted, and I sat in the back, watching the city pass by, thinking about how many times I'd traveled these roads when they were children, worrying about school fees, about rent, about tomorrow, never imagining that one day they'd look at me and see only what they thought was left. The office itself was unremarkable, clean, quiet, professional, and when the lawyer greeted us, Farhan shook his hand firmly, introducing himself with pride, as if taking charge came naturally to him. "We're here to go over my father's estate," he said, emphasizing father like it was a formality. The lawyer nodded, looking at me with polite interest, and asked, "Mr. Rahman, is that correct?" I met his gaze and smiled faintly. "Yes," I said, "we're here to talk about what's left." Farhan didn't notice the subtle emphasis I placed on those words, but the lawyer did. His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary before he gestured for us to sit. As we took our seats, I could feel the confidence radiating off my children, the assumption that this meeting would be quick, tidy, uneventful, and I felt a strange calm settle over me because for the first time in a long while I wasn't trying to be understood. I was simply waiting for the truth to speak for itself. When the lawyer opened his folder and began reviewing preliminary details, Farhan leaned back comfortably. Nayla crossed her legs, and I folded my hands, listening, thinking of all the years I'd chosen simplicity over display, security over praise, and how that choice had been mistaken for emptiness by the very people I made it for. As the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Before we proceed, there are several items you may not be aware of." I felt my children shift in their seats, mild curiosity replacing boredom, and I knew without a trace of spite, without any need to say a word, that by the time this meeting ended, the tone in that room would be very different because the man they believed had nothing left was about to be seen, perhaps for the first time, exactly as he was. The lawyer began slowly, the way men do when they sense they are about to correct a dangerous misunderstanding. And as he adjusted his glasses and scanned the first few pages in front of him, I noticed Farhan's confidence soften into polite attentiveness while Nayla straightened in her chair, finally placing her phone face down on the table as if she had suddenly remembered this meeting mattered. "Before we discuss distribution," the lawyer said calmly, "we need to establish the scope of Mr. Rahman's estate," and Farhan nodded briskly, already reaching for a pen like he expected a short list. But when the lawyer slid the first document across the table and said, "This concerns a property purchased in 1989, I felt the air shift, subtle but real, because Farhan frowned and asked, "Which property?" The lawyer looked up, mildly surprised. "A residential building registered solely under your father's name," he replied, and Nayla let out a small, involuntary sound, the kind people make when their expectations crack. Farhan chuckled lightly, trying to recover. "That must be the old place he mentioned years ago," he said. "It's probably worth very little now." The lawyer didn't react, he simply turned the page. "The building was renovated and partially leased in 2004, he continued. "It currently generates consistent rental income." Farhan's pen paused midair. "Rental income," he repeated, and for the first time that day he turned fully toward me, confusion flickering across his face, but I kept my gaze on the lawyer, letting the process unfold without interruption. Nayla leaned forward now, brows drawn together. "Papa never told us about this," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "Mr. Rahman was not obligated to," the lawyer replied evenly, and then he moved on to the next file, then another, and with each document the picture they had built of me, fragile, unprepared, nearly empty, lost another layer. There were investment accounts opened decades ago, modest at first but nurtured with patience, government bonds purchased during uncertain years, a small commercial plot that Farhan had driven past 100 times without knowing who owned it. And as the list grew, Farhan's posture changed from relaxed authority to stiff disbelief, his earlier certainty replaced by the uneasy realization that he had spoken about my life without understanding it. "Why would you keep all this hidden?" he finally asked, unable to stop himself, and I answered without looking at him. "Because I didn't raise you to measure me by numbers," I said quietly. Nayla's eyes filled with tears then, not dramatic ones, but slow, heavy ones that slid down her cheeks as she listened, and I could tell she was replaying years of small dismissals in her mind, jokes she'd let pass, assumptions she'd never questioned. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued, his voice steady, professional, almost gentle as he outlined the structure of my estate, the contingencies, the safeguards, and when he finally reached the summary, the number he spoke was not extravagant, not obscene, but substantial enough to command silence. And in that silence I felt no pride, only a deep ache for the misunderstanding that had made such revelation necessary. Farhan stared at the table, jaw tight. "I thought. I thought you didn't plan," he said slowly. "I thought you were just getting by." I finally looked at him then, at my son who had confused restraint with weakness. "I planned so you wouldn't have to worry," I said, "not so you could worry about me." The lawyer paused again, letting the words settle, then added, "There is also a clause your wife included years ago," and I felt a quiet gratitude that even in death she still shaped the room. "Mrs. Rahman insisted that any decisions regarding the estate be made with Mr. Rahman's full consent and authority," he read, "particularly in matters of residence and care." Nayla inhaled sharply. "Does that mean," she began. "It means," the lawyer said, "that no one can compel Mr. Rahman to sell, relocate, or alter his living arrangements against his wishes." Farhan closed his eyes briefly as if the weight of what he had almost done finally landed. "Abu," he said, voice low, "we were just trying to help." I nodded. "I know," I replied, and I meant it, because intentions matter, but so do assumptions, and theirs had nearly erased me. The meeting continued with technical details, but the tone had already changed completely. Farhan now asked questions carefully, deferentially, as if afraid of overstepping again, and Nayla listened with a seriousness I hadn't seen since she was a child learning something important for the first time. When the lawyer finally closed the folder and said, "That concludes today's review," the room felt different, quieter, but also clearer, like dust had settled after being kicked up for years. Outside in the hallway, Nayla wrapped her arms around me without hesitation, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Papa, I didn't see you." I held her gently. "You see me now," I said, and felt something loosen in my chest. Farhan stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor before finally meeting my eyes. "I thought you had nothing left," he admitted. "I was wrong," I nodded once. "We're all wrong sometimes," I said. "The mistake is thinking silence means emptiness." As we walked toward the exit, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because my children now understood my worth in financial terms, but because the narrative had shifted. I was no longer a man to be managed, but a man to be consulted, and that change, subtle as it was, mattered more than any figure the lawyer had read aloud. The city outside hummed with its usual indifference, cars passing, people moving on with their lives, but for me something fundamental had realigned, because the estate meeting they thought would confirm my decline had instead forced them to confront the depth of a life lived quietly, deliberately, and with far more left than they had ever imagined. After the meeting ended and we stepped back into the noise of the street, I thought the hardest part was over, but I quickly learned that truth does not end when it is spoken. It lingers, it unsettles, and it forces people to confront versions of themselves they were comfortable ignoring, and that confrontation followed us home like a quiet shadow. The drive back was nothing like the confident, almost casual ride to the lawyer's office. Farhan drove slower, his grip on the steering wheel tight, his mind clearly replaying the last hour again and again, while Nayla sat beside him staring straight ahead, eyes swollen, hands clasped together as if holding onto something fragile inside her, and I sat in the back seat watching them both, feeling neither victorious nor bitter, only deeply aware of how easily love can slip into entitlement when familiarity dulls respect. When we reached the house, Farhan didn't rush inside the way he usually did. Instead, he turned off the engine and sat there for a moment longer than necessary before clearing his throat. Abu, he said, not looking at me, I really didn't know. The words were simple, almost childlike, and for the first time in a long while, he sounded less like a man managing outcomes and more like a son realizing his assumptions had consequences. Not knowing isn't the same as not listening, I replied gently because I didn't want this to turn into punishment. I wanted it to turn into understanding. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted immediately, voices were lower, movements careful, as if everyone sensed the ground had changed and was afraid to step too hard. Nayla followed me into my room that evening, sitting on the edge of the bed the way she used to when she needed comfort, her voice trembling as she said, Papa, I really thought you were. I don't know, tired, finished with everything. I looked at her, my daughter who had once believed her father could fix anything, and I realized how time and convenience had quietly rewritten that belief. I am tired, I admitted, but tired doesn't mean empty, she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I should have defended you, she whispered. When Farin talked about handling your affairs, when we joked about how simple you live, I should have stopped it. I placed my hand over hers. Regret is only useful if it changes what comes next, I said, and she squeezed my hand like a promise. Farhan struggled more visibly. Over the next few days, he hovered in my presence with an awkward politeness, asking if I needed anything, offering to make tea, opening doors he had never noticed before, and though the gestures were clumsy, I recognized the effort behind them. One afternoon, he finally sat across from me in the living room and said, I thought being responsible meant taking control. I didn't realize I was taking it away from you. His honesty surprised me. Responsibility, I said, is making space for others to decide for themselves. He nodded slowly, absorbing it like a lesson he'd missed years ago. The estate meeting had done something else too. It had forced conversations we had avoided for a long time, conversations about aging, about fear, about how children sometimes cope with the idea of losing a parent by trying to manage them before they disappear. Farhan admitted that seeing me live so simply scared him, that he equated quiet with decline because it reminded him of how fragile life really is, and I listened without judgment, understanding that fear often disguises itself as control. I wasn't trying to erase you, he said. I was trying to prepare for losing you. The words landed softly but heavily, and for the first time I saw his actions not just as arrogance but as clumsy fear. Still, fear doesn't excuse disrespect, and that truth hung between us like a line neither of us could cross again. Over the next week, the household rhythm changed. Decisions were discussed instead of assumed, my opinions asked for instead of bypassed, and though it felt strange at first, it also felt right, like returning furniture to its proper place after years of imbalance. Nayla began involving me in her children's routines again, asking for advice, listening when I spoke, and I noticed how the children themselves responded, climbing into my lap more often, asking questions, sensing instinctively when an adult's place in the family has been restored. One evening, Farn brought out old photo albums I hadn't seen in years, spreading them across the table, pointing at pictures of himself as a boy and laughing softly. You always look so serious, he said. I thought you were strict, I smiled. I was focused, I replied. Someone had to be. As we turned pages, he grew quiet, and I could tell he was seeing those images differently now, not as a past he had outgrown, but as a foundation he had stood on without noticing. The lawyer called later that week to follow up on some details, and Farhan insisted on putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear, a small but meaningful shift that signaled transparency instead of control. And as technical matters were discussed, I noticed how Farhan deferred to me, waiting for my input, and how Nayla watched closely, as if relearning the balance of our roles. That night, alone in my room, I thought about how close I had come to being quietly sidelined by my own children, not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. And I felt a deep gratitude for the timing of that meeting, for the way truth arrived before resentment hardened into distance. I also thought about my wife, about how she had always insisted we prepare not just for our children's comfort, but for our own dignity, and I whispered a thank you into the dark, knowing she would have understood the quiet victory of being seen again. The estate meeting hadn't turned my children into villains or me into a hero. It had simply stripped away assumptions and forced honesty into a space where politeness had been hiding neglect. And as the days passed, I realized that what had truly changed wasn't their tone alone, but their awareness, because once you recognize someone's depth, you can never return to treating them as shallow. Sitting in the living room one afternoon watching my grandchildren play, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with assets or documents and everything to do with belonging, because my children no longer spoke about my life as something winding down, but as something still unfolding, and in that subtle shift in their words, their pauses, their respect, I found confirmation that the man they thought had nothing left had, in fact, reclaimed the one thing that mattered most. His place, intact and undeniable, at the center of his own family. By the time a second estate meeting was scheduled, the atmosphere in our family had already begun to shift, but it was a fragile change, the kind that can either settle into something healthy or crack again under pressure, and I could feel my children walking carefully around me, unsure whether respect meant distance or closeness, unsure how to speak to a father they were only now rediscovering. Farhan approached this meeting differently, calling me the night before to ask if I was comfortable, if there was anything I wanted addressed specifically. And though his voice still carried traces of guilt, it also carried sincerity, which mattered more than polished apologies ever could. The meeting itself was more formal this time, not because of paperwork but because expectations had changed. Farhan arrived early, papers neatly arranged, no longer leaning back like a man prepared to take over, but sitting upright, attentive, and when the lawyer entered, he greeted me first, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Nayla sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, a quiet declaration that she was no longer standing at a distance. And as the lawyer began reviewing long-term plans, maintenance of properties, income management, contingency care, I noticed how both of my children listened without interrupting, absorbing rather than steering, and it struck me how rarely parents are given the chance to watch their children relearn humility. At one point, Farhan asked about transferring certain responsibilities gradually, carefully framing the question as support rather than control, and the lawyer turned to me instead of answering directly, waiting for my response, which felt like a small but profound correction of the imbalance that had crept into our family. "We'll decide together," I said, and Farhan nodded immediately, no argument, no tension, just acceptance. When the meeting ended, the lawyer shook my hand warmly and said, "You've built something solid, Mr. Rahman, not just financially." And I understood what he meant, because what was being rebuilt now wasn't an estate but trust. The real test came later that week. At a family gathering, Farhan insisted on hosting, not as a performance, but as an attempt to reset something that had gone wrong. Relatives came, conversation flowed, and I noticed how Farhan corrected someone gently when they joked about my simplicity, saying that's his choice with a firmness that surprised even him. And Nayla sat beside me, involving me in stories, asking my opinion, restoring me to the rhythm of the family rather than treating me like a relic. I watched these moments quietly, not storing them as victories, but as signs of growth, because respect that comes from fear fades quickly, while respect that comes from understanding has roots. Later that evening, Farhan and I stood alone on the balcony, the city lights spread out before us, and he finally spoke the words he'd been circling for days. "I was scared," he admitted. "When I saw you living so simply, I thought it meant you were slipping away. I thought if I didn't take charge, I'd lose you." I listened, leaning against the railing, feeling the cool air settle around us. "You almost lost me anyway," I said softly, not accusing, just honest. He swallowed. "I know," he replied, "and I don't want to be that son." That night, something important settled between us, not a resolution, but a foundation for one. In the weeks that followed, my role in the family continued to change in subtle ways. Decisions were discussed, not delegated, my advice sought without urgency, my presence valued without being smothered, and I realized that the estate meeting had given my children something they didn't know they needed: permission to see me as capable without feeling threatened by it. I returned more often to my own routines, morning walks, reading, quiet afternoons, and instead of interpreting my independence as withdrawal, my children respected it, checking in without hovering, trusting rather than managing. One afternoon, Farhan surprised me by asking about my early years, about how I made decisions when money was tight, how I chose restraint when others chose display, and as I spoke, I saw him listening not as a child waiting for instruction, but as a man trying to understand a legacy that couldn't be summarized in documents. Nayla joined us, adding her own questions, and for the first time in a long while, the three of us talked without roles weighing down the conversation, just people connected by blood and history trying to align their understanding. The greatest change, though, was internal. I felt lighter not because my children now knew what I had, but because I no longer felt the need to guard my silence as fiercely, no longer felt invisible in a room full of family, and that relief was deeper than pride. I understood then that the estate meeting had not been an endpoint, but a mirror, one that forced my children to confront not just my past, but their assumptions, and forced me to confront my own habit of hiding behind simplicity to avoid difficult conversations. As weeks turned into months, the tone my children used when speaking to me remained changed, not overly reverent, not fearful, but balanced. And that balance was what I had always wanted, because authority without warmth isolates and warmth without authority erodes, and somewhere between those two, a family can breathe again. Standing one evening in the quiet of the house, listening to familiar sounds that no longer felt heavy, I realized that what had truly shifted wasn't their perception of my worth, but my own willingness to insist on it, and that insistence, calm and steady, had reshaped everything around me. The final shift did not come with another meeting or another document, but in a quiet moment weeks later, the kind of moment that would have passed unnoticed before everything changed. When I sat alone in the living room early one morning, the house still asleep, sunlight just beginning to touch the edges of the curtains, and I realized I no longer felt like a guest waiting to be managed, but like a man fully rooted in his own life again. Farhan joined me then, moving carefully as if he didn't want to break the peace, and sat across from me without speaking for a long time, and in that silence I recognized something important. He was no longer uncomfortable around me, no longer measuring his words or searching for control, but simply present, and when he finally spoke, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About silence not meaning emptiness," and I nodded, letting him continue because some lessons need space to finish forming. "I realized," he said, "that I spent so much time worrying about what you had left that I never asked what you still wanted." The question lingered between us, sincere and unguarded, and for the first time I answered without caution. "I want autonomy," I said. "Not isolation, not supervision, just the freedom to live the way I choose without being treated like I'm fading." Farhan nodded slowly, absorbing it like a commitment rather than a suggestion. Later that day, Nayla joined us, bringing tea, sitting close, and for the first time in months, the conversation flowed easily, touching on ordinary things, plans for the children, small household matters. But underneath it all was a new current of respect that didn't need to announce itself. Over the following days, that respect became visible in small, meaningful ways. My opinion was asked before decisions were made, not after. My routines were accommodated rather than questioned. My simplicity was no longer treated as an inconvenience but as a personal choice, and I realized how profoundly those small shifts healed something I hadn't admitted was wounded. One afternoon, while watching my grandchildren play in the courtyard, Farhan stood beside me and said almost casually, "I told them today that you're not slowing down, you're just not loud about moving forward." And I felt a quiet satisfaction at that, not because my children now spoke well of me, but because they understood me well enough to speak truthfully. The estate documents were finalized soon after, filed away neatly, no longer looming over us like a threat, but resting quietly where they belonged, tools rather than weapons. And I found that once the fear of being dismissed was gone, the fear of being misunderstood faded with it. Nayla, in her own way, tried to make amends, sharing memories of her mother, asking questions about the past she had never thought to ask, and I saw how these conversations grounded her, how understanding where she came from gave her steadiness she hadn't known she lacked. One evening, as we sat together looking through old photographs, she paused at an image of me standing proudly beside a modest home I'd built decades earlier, and she said softly, "I thought you lived simply because you had to," and I smiled. "I lived simply because it let me sleep at night," I replied, and she laughed through her tears, finally understanding that restraint is often a form of freedom. As time passed, I noticed how my children's tone, once careful then apologetic, settled into something natural and balanced, neither patronizing nor overly deferential, and that balance was the true outcome of everything we'd been through, because it meant we could move forward without tiptoeing around the past. The estate meeting had changed their tone, yes, but what followed had changed our relationship, replacing assumptions with conversations, control with trust, and silence with understanding. One quiet evening, as the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, I stood by the window and reflected on how close I had come to being gently erased by the very people I loved most, not through malice, but through misunderstanding, and how easily that erasure could have become permanent if I hadn't allowed truth to surface when it did. I thought about the man I had been when my children were young, the man who carried responsibility quietly, who believed that providing without explaining was enough, and I understood then that simplicity, while powerful, must sometimes be accompanied by clarity, because dignity thrives best when it is both practiced and recognized. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt no need to rehearse explanations or defend my choices. My children no longer saw me as a man with nothing left, but as a man who had deliberately held something back, and that distinction changed everything. In the end, the estate meeting did not elevate me, it revealed me, and the man it revealed was not wealthy or poor, strong or weak, but complete, and that completeness was finally visible to those who mattered most. Lying in the quiet, listening to the steady sounds of a home that once again felt like mine, I felt a deep, settled peace, knowing that my voice had been restored, my place reaffirmed, and my future, contrary to what anyone had believed, was not something to be managed, but something still fully, unmistakably my own.